This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Shine on Punxsutawney, I'm gonna let it shine. Every day, every day, every day, every day, gonna let my little light shine.
Well, good morning. When I was your age, everybody called me Georgie. And I've written a book that has a lot of stories in it. And some of the stories are sad, some of the stories are funny, but all the stories are true. Every story is 100% true, and everybody in the book was a real person. And so, there's a lot of stories in here. Does anybody want a particular story? What about you?
Grandpa George, can you tell us about the chicken wagon?
Yeah, I would like to talk about the chicken wagon. Let's just talk about that this morning, okay? Do you see this wagon up here? Did you see it when you were coming in?
Yeah.
That's my 70-year-old wagon. I got it as a birthday present, and there's a picture of me when I got it. I was 4 years old when I got the wagon, and I'm 74 now, and so this wagon is 70 years old, and I take care of my stuff, and I still have it. So this morning, let's talk about the chicken wagon. See this picture behind me? Well, we're going to talk about that. This book is called Surviving Georgie, and it's about the people who were in my world, and they tried to survive me. And it's also about me surviving. There's several stories in here where I almost got killed. Once from a huge rabid dog that was trying to kill me. And another time when I fell through the ice. And how my dad saved me from death. I wouldn't be here if it hadn't been for several times in the book here where my dad saved my life. But the problem is, I don't know how he survived me or how my teachers survived me, because I was probably the weirdest little boy ever. The world was my Disneyland. And everything in it was like a ride. And all the people in my world, I thought they were there to entertain me. In fact, I still kind of think like that. And so I was raised on a little dairy farm, and we had chickens. So I'm going to tell you the story of my older brother, and when he read to me a story, I wasn't able to read yet. And so here we go, page 81. This is called Dogs, Cows, Chickens, and Other Handy Modes of Transportation. Y'all ready? At the age of 5, I couldn't yet read, but my brother Mo was 3 years older than I and could read well. I loved hearing stories read to me. Did anybody ever read stories to you when you were little? Great, yeah. Isn't that fun?
No.
Some changed my life, or at least Daddy's life, and the lives of our farm animals. The first story I remember Mo reading to me was the Greek myth of Daedalus and Icarus. Anybody ever hear that story? Yeah. Well, you may recall the story. They were trapped on an island from which there was no escape. But the dad, Daedalus, devised a clever plan. He made wings for himself and his son, and they would fly away. Their only worry was flying up too near the sun, where the heat would melt the wax on their wings. The story gave no source for the feathers or for the wax. Icarus, being disobedient and disrespectful of his dad's advice, flew up too near the sun. The wax melted and he fell into the sea. End of story and end of Icarus. Even age 5, I knew I was smart enough to not fly too near the sun, finding feathers would be no problem. We owned about 50 chickens, and they dropped feathers all over the place. I didn't know what wax was, but I figured with enough feathers, wings could be made. I was wrong. I tied a bunch of feathers together, flapped them like crazy, and I didn't get an inch off the ground. Are you surprised that I couldn't fly? Yeah, it didn't work. Wait a second. Of course, Daedalus and Icarus had actual wings. I saw the picture in the book. Chickens have feathers, but chickens also have wings themselves. I went down to the tool shed and brought up a nice, sharp hatchet, and I planned on taking some chicken wings. Chickens didn't need them. They didn't fly around like pigeons. They just walked around wherever they went. Now, it's no easy task for a little boy to catch a chicken. They simply run too fast. You ever try to catch a chicken? Man, can they run, okay?
I caught someone.
Yeah. And sneaking up on one with my hatchet in my hand, well, that's nearly impossible. Chickens aren't that dumb. That's when I noticed the chickens were walking around picking up kernels of corn. If chickens were focused on corn, they may not notice me. I got some corn, and I made a little trail of corn kernels up to my feet. Corn kernel, next one, next one, next one, finally up to my foot. This was going to work. She was pecking her way up towards me. As she pecked for the last kernel of corn, I grabbed her. At that point, I figured a test run would be best. Would the chicken wings actually work? I hadn't seen chickens do much flying. I found a 30-foot length of baler twine. There's a lot more where that came from. It was all over the place. I tied it around her foot, and I carried her up to the highest window in our barn, about 50 feet high. You'll learn more about the barn later on. I held one end onto the twine and gave her a toss out the window. It worked. She flew about 30 feet out nicely, got to the end of her rope, swung back, swung down and hit the bottom of the barn. Thump. So I hoisted her back up, gave her a second toss. It worked again, not as well as the first flight. The third and fourth flights were just drops. The chickens wings, they worked. And I only needed the pair for a while, even though the chicken couldn't fly very well after the first attempt. Well, it still worked. So I let that chicken go, but not until I wanted those wings. Now, this is going to sound violent and gory, but only because that was my plan. I held her down with one foot and stretched out a wing. Just as I raised the hatchet, I heard a familiar voice. Georgie! Let that chicken go! Where did he come from? Daddy was really mad at me this time. He snatched the hatchet from my hand and informed me that what I was about to do wouldn't work and it would cause the chicken a lot of distress. So I temporarily gave up the idea of flying. Tommy and the goat cart. The second story I remember Mo reading to me was The Goat Boy of Holland. The poor little Dutch boy couldn't work, but he had a goat. His dad would tie the goat to the little boy's cart, and the little boy could travel all over the village. By the way, there's me at age 4 with my wagon. Got it as a Christmas present. So, a goat can pull a wagon. Wow! Another great idea. Goats were useful modes of transportation. That's all the information I needed. I could walk just fine. But why walk if I could ride? Already had a little red wagon, which was good as a cart. All I needed was a goat. Our family is German, and Germans are pragmatists. That means we're practical about stuff. We ran a dairy farm, and goats were unnecessary to the farm operation. Daddy informed me there would be no goat, period. When Daddy made a decision, it was final. I was sitting on the porch steps deep in thought and a bit miffed at the poor response I got from my goat request. That's when Tommy walked by. Tommy was our long-legged Beagle hound and probably the best rabbit hound in the county. I guess we called him long-legged because his legs were longer than the short-legged Beagle kind. Tommy could find a rabbit and then chase it back to you. Sometimes the rabbit would run half a mile in the opposite direction. But Tommy could eventually bring it back, and you could have a rabbit. It struck me that Tommy was almost the size of a goat, and maybe just the size I needed to pull my wagon. Tommy was docile. That means he was tame, and he would do just about whatever needed to be done. That is, if it dealt with rabbits. But as a draft animal, Tommy was uncooperative. I found some baler twine, easy since it was all over the place, and I cut a piece for the job. I tied one end to the wagon and the other end to Tommy's leather collar. Then I sat back in the wagon, anticipating a fabulous ride. But Tommy just stood there, and I just sat there. Nothing was happening. That's where sticks come in handy. I found a nice long stick, sat back in the wagon, and whacked Tommy on the back. Nothing. He just stood there, and he turned around like he was asking, why? A 5-year-old isn't very good at whacking, and my efforts lacked the strength and resolve to get the job done. A few whacks later, Tommy just lay down in front of the wagon, and he didn't move. He simply didn't understand his new role in life. Maybe Tommy wasn't big enough. A bigger animal could pull me around. The heifer and the goat cart. Do you know what a heifer is?
No.
That's a young cow, isn't it? Yeah. Any farm kids in here? No. Well, I'm a farm. Oh, great. You know what a heifer is. Well, that's when I noticed some heifers milling around in the barnyard. They were just going around in the barnyard. If you study the old farm photo in the front of the book, by the way, there's a picture of my farm when I was born. It's in the front of the book. And it shows where everything happens in the book, except when I went to school. By the way, the school I went to wasn't nearly as good as this one, I'll tell you. But it's all about in this book as well. Well, there were some heifers milling around in the barnyard. If you study the old farm photo, you can see we had a nice cow path from the barnyard to the watering trough, about 50 yards away. That would be the test area for heifers. They certainly had the strength to pull me. I'd seen a lot of lassoing in cowboy movies. You ever see a cowboy throw a lasso and it goes over the neck of a horse or a cow and stops it? Maybe in a rodeo. It looked easy. You just threw a lasso around the cow's neck and you stopped it dead in its tracks. To get a heifer to pull me, I'd have to lasso it first. I found a longer piece of baler twine, more where that came from, and made a lasso. It wasn't much of a lasso because all I knew how to make was a slip knot, but it worked. I walked up to the heifer, threw the lasso over its head, and that took about 50 tries, and tied the other end of the rope to my wagon. It was working. It wasn't working. The heifer just stood there, same as Tommy did. It was just standing there. There I was sitting in my wagon. Heifer wasn't pulling. Maybe it needed some persuasion. I leaned out of my wagon and picked up a rock. The heifer was pointed in the right direction, the lane to the watering trough. This would be a really great ride. When animals are startled by something, let's say a rock hitting them in the rump, they don't behave as one might think. No, they just run. That heifer took a jump off the starting line and headed for some place safe. The heifer was running fast, and there was a lot of baler twine between her and my wagon. That's where an explanation of momentum and inertia comes in. I didn't understand Sir Isaac Newton's laws of physics at the time, but this law applied to me. When the slack was taken up, the wagon simply went out from under me. So she was running like crazy. All of a sudden, the slack gave out. I was sitting still, but the wagon was suddenly moving at about 20 miles an hour. What do you think happened to me?
You crashed. Yeah, you tumbled.
Onto the ground. I saw earth, sky, earth, sky, earth, sky within about a 1-second trip to the ground. As I lay there in the dust, listening to my wagon bouncing up the cow path, I saw legs walking by. Chicken legs. I already told you that I was unafraid of chickens. And as you know, Daddy had a year earlier killed the only rooster capable of defending them that day. That's from another story. We had this gigantic rooster that was chasing me around until Daddy saw it happening. Shot it with a slingshot. The chicken tame. Mother had a box of 20 Mule Team Borax. Anybody ever see one of those? It had a picture of a wagon being pulled by 20 mules. A thought came to me. Dogs are too small and uncooperative. Heifers are too big and dangerous. Chickens are too weak. But what about a team of chickens? Big team. It took me almost an hour to retrieve my wagon because that stupid heifer kept getting spooked by the sounds of the wagon behind her. Every time I got close, she moved, and then the wagon would move, and it would make noise, and then she'd take off running again, and the wagon would be running up all over the lane again. A couple of times I got tempted to get back in, but I was still smarting from the first time that I got in, so I didn't want to get back in the wagon. Finally, she got thirsty, headed for the watering trough. While she drank, I was able to get the wagon untied. The lasso was still around her neck, but that'd have to wait. I can't remember ever getting around to removing the lasso. Maybe it just wore off sometime that summer. Or more likely, Daddy found a heifer with twine around her neck and freed her. But I can't remember him mentioning it to me. Okay, back to the current episode of putting together a team of chickens to pull my wagon. I would need to catch a dozen or more. How did I catch the first one? Anybody? Yes?
You put like these corn nibbles in front of you.
Right, that's what I did. I put kernels of corn. So I just did that about 14 times. It took me forever to catch a dozen chickens. They're probably the dumbest creatures on earth, but it seemed they were watching their sisters getting captured one by one, and they deduced that corn trails led to disaster. When I finally had my 12th chicken, I tied all the chicken twines to my wagon and got in. Is there a chicken twine in here? I don't see one. Oh well. I had some in there. Okay. Oh, is the time almost over? Oh, let me finish up real quick. Okay. Chickens are not only dumb that they can't get their act together. It didn't matter how hard I brought down the branch on the right side or the left side, they still ran to the right or to the left. Well, I can't remember any running to the front. Totally disorganized, and I wasn't moving an inch. Unfortunately, I didn't know how to make very good knots. The only knot I knew how to make was a slip knot, which didn't bode well for the chickens. As the chickens tried to escape, the twine got tighter around their necks until they were simply lying around on the ground, choking to death. By that time, the squawks and the commotion had awakened Daddy from his afternoon nap. He stepped out onto the porch, rubbing his eyes in disbelief. What the Sam Hill? Chickens! I sat there in the wagon, fascinated with the new drama at hand. Daddy had great big strong hands, but they weren't very good at pulling the twines off the chickens' necks. It was interesting watching him trying to get his fingers in between the twine and the necks, attempting to untie those little slip knots to keep his chickens from strangling to death. As I recall, we had chicken for Sunday's dinner. Daddy didn't look like he enjoyed it much, though. Thank you for listening to me today.
Burning question they need to ask Mr. Caylor about writing this book or what it's like to be an author?
Okay, loud and clear, because I don't hear well.
Did it take you a long time to write that book?
It took me about a year to write the book because it covers my ages 5 to 12, back in 1949 to 1956. But it just, as I started remembering things, everything just came to me. But my daddy said he did not want me to publish until after he was in heaven. Well, he died at age 100. So I wrote the book about 10 years ago. But he didn't die until he was 100. So I had to wait. Okay, I'll take your question, and I'll take more questions. You can email me through the school if you want, and I'll take more questions. Yes, you, loud and clear.
What was it like when you went to school?
What was it like? You have to read the book. About a third of the book is about my school experiences with Miss Calhoun, the most unfortunate teacher in the history of teaching. She didn't know that when she entered my universe, just how awful it would be. I was not a mean kid. I was just curious about the way things worked and what people would do when I was around them. Can we get just one more?
One more.
One more. You.
So where did you get all of the painting and stuff?
With all the what?
The painting.
The illustrations, maybe?
Oh, the illustrations. The illustrations are in the book. I have a good friend, Steve Bartholomew, who drew the pictures for me. There's the pictures of the chickens pulling me, a picture of the me falling through the ice, and my dad pulling me out. And I wrote this book for people 60 and over so that they would remember the way things were. But what I discovered was, from my 6-year-old granddaughter, who can read very well, she said, "Grandpa George, every little kid is going to want to read this book." And so I thought, the stories in here are pretty bad. I don't know if they should read this book. And the Amish guy who said, "This is the best book he's ever read and a perfect family book," the head of the Pennsylvania Dutch community said, "It's the perfect family book." But he did not want his kids tying all his chickens to their wagon. And I said, "Well, just tell him not to do the stuff that little Georgie did, okay?" Anyway, thank you.
Every day, every day, every day.